before they start letting the water out, they always open up the spill gates up above. And within the first hour, they say keep an eye on the rock and stand or free water call. Start back into the shore.
So she finally told me what I had to do, and I said I will do exactly that. I have to write down each of the names during this front desk.
Enjoying their dessert a little bit here. I don't know if all of you have had a chance to talk with Bruce, but we're fortunate to have a former commanding officer of the Bainbridge here with us tonight, Rear Admiral Bruce Newell and his wife Teresa. Admiral Newell completed a distinguished 29 years in the Navy, and he was trained at the Naval Academy, the U.S. Naval Academy. He served many roles during that career, such as commanding officer in his early career, towing the towing and salvage ship Tacoma, the ATF-113 in Pearl Harbor. He also served as executive officer of the nuclear propulsion prototype plant, the training facility in Ballston Spa, New York. And then 3 years as executive officer on the USS Truxtun, CGN-35. 1971, he was commanding officer of the destroyer Charles Adams, Dlgn. And in 1974, as we all know, some of us know, he was the 5th commanding officer of the USS Bainbridge, CGN-25. He served on the Bainbridge as commanding officer from 1974 until 1977. After returning to Washington, D.C., he served in the Pentagon on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations and also on the staff of the Secretary of the Navy. He received the Navy Distinguished Service Cross for his service at that time, and then retiring in 1984 from the Navy. So it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Rear Admiral Bruce Newell.
We've had a wonderful experience here at this reunion. And one of the things that we've seen is the effect of one person, Lincoln, the governor of Buchanan, who became the president, and even the things we saw today. I want to make this video for you to show to your family and to your children and your grandchildren. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the significance of the Bainbridge in the history of the country, in the history of the Navy. And I want you to know that I don't care how long you served in the ship. I want you to know that what you did made a difference. And I hope as you hear me go through this, you will see that the value of this ship and the value of the nuclear Navy, the value of Hymen Rickover, whether you liked him or didn't like him, was a significant part of our history. And so we made a difference. We who served in the Bainbridge, we made a difference in history. And your part is important, and your family needs to know that you were part of something historic in the United States Navy, and it happened. The Bainbridge was a key part of it. So that's the purpose of the video, and really what I want to try to share with you tonight, because I think we've done something great, and I don't want history to forget it. There are no nuclear-powered cruisers in the Navy anymore, but there were 9, and every one of them was important, and the fact that we had a nuclear Navy is important. First, let me thank Bob Hemingway and Gail. They're not here, but I know that you all know that we're here in Lancaster because of them and because of they picked the venues that we've been to, and I think it was very important. Certainly Dick Holloway and Lita are indispensable to this association, and we all know that, and he's never going to find anybody to replace him, right? Good. And Joe Bissick and Diana, thank you so much for your leadership as the president and the association. I have, as you saw, served in 5 ships and commanded 3, and There is no organization like Bainbridge in my experience in the 5 ships I served in. I don't go to those reunions, but I go to this one, and I get the newsletter for this one, and I'm really grateful for that. One of the things about reunions, we say about Christianity, it's not a religion, it's about a relationship. And that's what this association is. It's not about a ship or a period of time we served, it's about relationships. We have a common thing that we did, and that's what this is all about that I'm going to talk about tonight. If I ask you all what the most important person, what person had the most impact on your life, I hope you have somebody. I will tell you I had a math teacher who made me a nuke in high school. I mean, that's how I got there. I stood in the upper half of my Naval Academy class in math because of Mr. Lindsay. There was a priest who sort of encouraged me to practice my faith more deeply, and that's how I ended up as an Episcopal priest. But there was one man who changed it all for me, and his name was Hymen Rickover. You all know, I think, that Jimmy Carter was a submariner under Rickover and wrote a book called Why Not the Best? And they asked him, where'd that come from? And when Rickover interviewed him, he asked him all kinds of questions. Carter was a pretty smart man. And he finally said to him, to Jimmy Carter, did you do your best? And Jimmy Carter said, well, I'm not sure if I did. I guess I have to say I didn't. And Rickover said, why not? And that changed Carter's life. Rickover changed mine also. So I want to talk about this man who had a great impact on my life. He's called the father of the nuclear navy. We called him the KOG, the kindly old gent. He was anything but a kindly old gent. He was different. He retired in 1982, 60 years after he graduated from the Naval Academy. He was the longest serving naval officer in the history of our country. He was born in 1900, and he died in 1986. He served 64 years, if you count the 4 years at the Naval Academy. Graduated from the Naval Academy in 1922. He stood 107 out of 540 in his Naval Academy class. That surprises most people because they thought he must have been a genius. The Bainbridge was commissioned 6th October 1962. It was decommissioned 13 September 1996, and Teresa and I were there when they deactivated the ship. In June 1975, while I was the commanding officer, it changed from the Dlgn 25 to the CLGN 25. So I went from commanding a destroyer leader to a cruiser. It was a marvelous experience. Rickover had an impact on the Bainbridge for 20 of its 34 years, a direct impact, and those of you who are in engineering know that very well. 10 years of my career were under his, whatever you want to call it, leadership, pestering, phone calling. I was XO of a prototype and XO of a cruiser and CO of a cruiser, and for 9 years he was there. But when I became Chief of Information for the Navy and Chief of Legislative Affairs the last 4 years of my career, it was the time he was retiring. And I was working for John Lehman, the Secretary of the Navy, and Bob Watkins, the CNO, and Rickover was still calling me up and asking me why those stupid people were doing those stupid things. Who is Hymen Rickover? Let me read you, I'm going to read you several quotes during this talk to help you remember who he is and who he was, and to remind you that you knew him. You knew this man because you were, your captain, or XO, or your engineer were harassed by him. Admiral Hymen Rickover has been declared in retrospect as the most famous and controversial admiral of his era. Hyperactive, political, blunt, confrontational, insulting, flamboyant, and an unexcelled workaholic. Rickover was always demanding of others without regard for rank or position, as well as himself. Moreover, he had little tolerance for mediocrity, none for stupidity. Quote, "If a man is dumb," said a Chicago friend, "Rickover thinks he ought to be dead." Even while a captain, Rickover did not conceal his opinions, and many of the officers whom he regarded as dumb eventually rose to the rank of admirals and were assigned to the Pentagon. Maybe I was one of them. He was a Polish immigrant. He was born in Poland. He was an immigrant. When he was 6 years old in 1906, he came to America to flee the anti-Semitic people in Russia. He graduated with honors in high school in Chicago. He said when he was asked how he performed in high school, he said, "The first 3 years in high school, I memorized everything because I was smart. By the senior year of high school, I began to realize I had to learn something." Unknowing this, in my interview with him, he asked me why, after 2 years at the Naval Academy, where I had gotten very good grades, my grades fell in my third year. And I said, and it was true, it's because I was really smart. And the first 2 years, I could memorize everything and get great grades. But finally it got tough in the third year, and I had to start learning what they were teaching me. Maybe that's why he accepted me into his program. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1922. He had a most interesting career as he grew up. He got involved in ship repair during the war. He had risen through the ranks, serving in the Nevada, but in Pearl Harbor, he was involved in ship repair and overhaul. And he got assigned to recover the battleship California, which was sunk at Pearl Harbor. And he did a magnificent job. That ship was sunk, sitting on the bottom, holes blown in it on December 7th, 1941. By June, it was in Puget Sound. It had been repaired and went back and fought the war for the rest of the time, fought the rest of the war. And that was his primary achievement up until the time we get to the point about nuclear power. From 1929 to 33, he got involved in diesel submarines. And that's where he began to get the concept of the idea that we need to have nuclear submarines. Most of you know that a diesel submarine must surface to breathe in order to recharge the batteries that make the ship run. So he conceived of the idea with some support for making a nuclear power Navy, and I'll come back to that. He did have one brief period for 3 months as commanding officer of a mine sweep in China, in the Chinese fleet, or Chinese area. In 1937, he made lieutenant commander and changed to engineering duty officer. Now, most of you know that you can make that choice in the Navy if you want to. If you're really good in engineering and you don't want to go to sea and you're not looking to command a ship, you can become an EDO, or an engineering duty officer. And he did that in 1937 and then stopped going to sea in ships. As I said, he got very much involved in ship repair. He was assigned to Bureau of Engineering in Washington, D.C., worked there. They said that he was able to do the impossible in fixing the California. That was the example. He was active after the war in recovering some of our ships and served in Okinawa for that. Then he began his nuclear career. From 1922, when he graduated from the academy, until 1947, after the war, I would call that 25 years of preparation. There was no nuclear navy. There wasn't even an idea of having one at that point. But he had become the kind of person we call him the irascible old coot. He had become very effective and very successful, impossible to work for, but had achieved great things. And so after 25 years of preparation, he began a career from 1947 to 1982, where he was the father of the nuclear navy. And I want to talk a little bit about that. In 1946, we had dropped the bomb, the nuclear bomb. and all things nuclear were beginning to take shape. The Manhattan Project was very active in developing that bomb. At the end of the Manhattan Project, after the bomb had been made, someone said, let's build a nuclear electric generating plant. Let's see if we can make electricity with nuclear power. We got a bomb that does it. So the Manhattan Project began to explore the idea of making some kind of an operating engine that was nuclear powered. The government assigned 8 men, picked 8 really bright people to look at this thing and see if they could do that. And Rickover, being a very bright person who got things done, was placed in charge of this Manhattan Project idea. He went to Oak Ridge, worked there, went to Schenectady, worked there, and then the Navy said, well, look, if you're going to do that, let's build a nuclear power plant for a destroyer. Now, I want you to remember this. The concept of the Bainbridge was before we thought about submarines. The first thing that Rickover worked on was a nuclear power plant for a destroyer, which produced the Bainbridge. And then came the idea, Nimitz was the CNO. Admiral Nimitz, the hero of Midway, was the chief of naval operations, a diesel submariner. And he said, look, guys, it's more important because of the way we see the strategic world going in the future to build a submarine. And so they began, both were going at the same time. Let's build a nuclear powered destroyer. Let's build a nuclear powered submarine. And in 1947, the CNO approved the design of a submarine and gave the job to Rickover. Now let me read you, this is part of who we are here. Let me read you what they faced in 1947 when they told this, I can say, wise-ass captain, I want you to build a nuclear submarine. In early 1950s, a megawatt-scale nuclear reactor took up an area roughly the size of a city block. And he's going to build one for a submarine or destroyer. The prototype for the USS Nautilus propulsion plant was the world's first high-temperature nuclear reactor. The basic physics data needed for the reactor's design were as yet unavailable. They hadn't figured it out yet. We didn't learn that you could control nuclear power by steam demand until we lit off the plant. We thought we had to pull the rods to make reactivity go up and down. What we found out is when we opened the throttle, the temperature of the water went down, neutrons slowed down, and we got more reactivity. We didn't discover that until we did it. The reactor designs yet had not even been developed. There were no available engineering data on the performance of water-exposed metals that were simultaneously experiencing high temperatures, pressure, and multispectral radiation levels. We didn't know any of this stuff. No nuclear power plant of any kind had ever been designed to produce steam. No steam propulsion plant had ever been designed for use in the widely varying sea temperatures and pressures experienced by the condensers during submarine operations. Components from difficult exotic materials such as zirconium and hafnium would have to be extracted and manufactured with precision via techniques that were as yet unknown. In 1949, with all these problems facing him, Rickover, now in charge, the Atomic Energy Commission Reactor Development Division, called Naval Reactors, was formed, and Rickover was placed in charge and said, well, you have these little problems, go fix them. Make a submarine plant and make a destroyer plant. From 1951 to 52, this man, who was now the head, who had been out of the Naval Academy for 30 years, was passed over as a captain twice because he was such an irascible old coot, nobody on the selection board would pick him. And here he was in charge of all this. In the Navy, when you reach 30 years, if you have not been picked for admiral, you retire. When Rickover reached 30 years, he had been passed over twice. Congress, in their infinite wisdom, in those days did things right, said, wait a minute, this is stupid. I don't care if you don't like him. We like him, and they selected him on a special board for admiral. In 1954, 2 years after he had been picked for admiral, this is what Time magazine wrote about him. January 17th, 1954, the cover of Time magazine, 2 years after he'd been passed over twice for admiral. Sharp-tongued Hymen Rickover spurred his men to exhaustion, ripped through red tape, and drove contractors into rages. He went on making enemies, but by the end of the war, he had won the rank of captain. He also had the reputation as a man who got things done. 17 June 1955, the SSN 571, the USS Nautilus, was underway on nuclear power. They called him to do it in 47. 7 years later, impossibly, we had a ship underway on nuclear power. October 1962, 5 years after they picked him to do this, the Bainbridge was underway on nuclear power. In 1966, 41 fleet ballistic missile submarines, the greatest strategic deterrent to nuclear war, were underway on nuclear power. If you don't see yourself as part of this yet, you're not following me, because you are. Here we are. We were part of all this. In 1965, Sea Orbit took place. How many of you were on Sea Orbit? See the hands? Sea Orbit. 3 ships, CVN 65, the Enterprise, CGN 9, the Cruiser Long Beach, and Dlgn 25, steamed around the world. They left on 7/31 and got back on October 3rd. That's a most amazing engineering feat in the history of this country, in my judgment. And one man, one irascible old coot, pushed it through. And those of you who were on Bainbridge or in Bainbridge were part of this historic thing. Rickover, let me talk a little bit about who he was and what he did. He interviewed me. I was captain of an ocean-going tug in the Pacific. Happy to be in command as a lieutenant. I got this message, come back for an interview with Admiral Rickover. I didn't know who he was. They flew me back. I had my interview with him. He interviewed all the officers who were selected to be nuclear power officers. That man interviewed 14,000 officers individually in his career. The stories of those interviews are true. The one that you all know is about the desk. In comes the wimpy officer, and he's in the interview. He's really smart, but he's a wimp. And Rickover says, you know, I don't think you could make me mad if you had to. And the guy sort of sits there meekly, and he says, well, do you think you can? Yes, sir, I think I can. Well, go ahead. The guy stands up, takes his arm, and wipes everything off of Rickover's desk on the floor. Rickover took him. We all have all kinds of stories. I could spend a long time talking mine. The best one for me was you're interviewed by 3 scientists before, and you know you have to have stood the upper half of your class and gotten A's in calculus and physics and stuff like that. So I'd done all that stuff. But I also played soccer at the Naval Academy. And Rickover did not think that athletics was worth doing. You should be studying, and you should not be playing any kind of ball. So in the interviews I had, they all asked me questions about my academic background and what I'd been doing on ships and things like that. Nobody ever asked me about soccer. So he did. He said, did you do anything else at the Naval Academy besides study? And I said, yes, sir. You always told him the truth. What did you do? I played soccer. Do you agree it was a waste of time? No, sir, I don't. Well, were you any good? Yes, sir, I was. How do you know? I made first-string All-American, sir. And he threw me out. That was the end of my interview, right there on the spot. So I sat for the rest of the day in a little room, never knowing whether I'd passed or not. At the end of the day, they walked in, handed me a calculus book, and said, go back to your ship and study this. You're in. And that's how I got through. But there are other things in those interviews. But if you hear stories about those interviews, most of them are true. They're very Carlisle Trust, who was a CNO, stood higher in every class than any other officer in the Navy had ever gotten in the Naval Academy, was first in all his classes. And Rickover asked him, "Do you think you were smarter than I was?" And Trow said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Why?" And Rickover said, I stood high in my class in some subjects in the Naval Academy. And Trow answered the truth. I stood higher in my classes than anybody ever had before. Okay, and he took him. I guess most of you know, in order to be a nuclear officer, and many of you did it, you had to go through 1 year, 6 months of academic training, nuclear power school. You had to go through 6 months at the prototype. I did it at Saratoga Springs. And you had to qualify as engineering officer of the watch. Then when you came back, I have 3 years as XO at the prototype, 3 years as XO of Truxtun. When I came back to be CO, you had to qualify as engineer. I hadn't been an engineer. And so you had to go 13 weeks to naval reactors and take the engineer's exam and passed it. Why? Rickover was a really smart fella. The budget for the nuclear powered ships in the Navy were in the Department of Defense. The budget for the reactor plant was in the Department of Energy. And in order to become the captain of a ship, you had to get a license from the Department of Energy with the Atomic Energy Commission so you could command the ship and tell the engineer what to do. What did he do? He got money from the Department of Energy and he got money from the Department of Defense. He got a lot of money to make the new, and that's one of the reasons why he was so successful in getting that done. But reactor safety, why all this? Why was he such an irascible old coot? Why did he harass us so much? I'll tell you some more stories about that at the end here. Because he wanted to be sure that we never had a measurable change of the environment in any nuclear-powered ship or submarine. And so the reactor safety was the highest value that he had. And let me just read you a quote. U.S. submarines far outperform the Soviet ones in the critical area of stealth. And Rickover's obsessive fixation on safety and quality control gave the U.S. Navy a vastly superior safety record to the Soviet Union. This was especially crucial as in a democratic society, our society, particularly after the 3 Mile Island incident, and you know they're shutting TMI down now, and particularly after the 3 Mile Island nuclear power station crisis in March of '79, a host of nuclear accidents or well-publicized near misses could have shut down the nuclear navy completely. The Soviet Union has had 14 nuclear ship problems releasing radioactivity. We've had 0. Those of you who served in the engineering department of the ships and submarines of our Navy helped keep that record so. We were harassed, but Rickover would tell you it was worth it, and he meant for you to be that way so that we could be that safe. Personnel integrity and safety was his other thing. I never had a problem in convincing my engineers that if you scram the reactor and tell me why it happened, I don't care how stupid what you did, you tripped a coolant pump, you'll never be punished for that. Because the thing is to get the plant back up again. So we had absolute accountability, absolute integrity in the running of those propulsion plants, and it was because Rickover insisted on that. And you who are in those ships were part of that. That was the character of the nuclear navy. In my, when we finished refueling at Bremerton, Washington, as you know, you go on a 4-hour full power run to prove that everything is safe. And Rickover comes aboard and he rides those. He rode every nuclear powered ship and every nuclear powered submarine when they went critical. So he's riding the Bainbridge. We've 28 months in overhaul, worked our tails off, passed the pre-exams. He's aboard, and we're doing 30 knots for 4 hours in Puget Sound. You do an hour before you start, 4 hours to run. About 3 hours into it. I've been up for an hour getting ready, been running for 3 hours. I've done 4 hours. Some little box his engineers put on my ship failed. It wasn't my plan. It wasn't anything we'd done. It was some device that measured something. So we had to shut the plant down. We haven't done 4 hours for score. We've done 1 plus 3. Woke him up, 2 o'clock in the morning. I've been up all night. Admiral, we have finished 4 hours of full power. 1 hour for preparing, 3 hours for now, and one of the things you put on my ship has failed. I would like to count this. No. He said no. Start again. Do 4 hours more. At 2 o'clock in the morning, we did it. That was the kind of guy he was. And that was characteristic of the man for the whole time he did this. And that was the way we lived on the Bainbridge. For those families that are here, you wonder why we worked so hard and we're gone so long and worked 12-hour days, because that's what the man was like. A couple sea stories. When we were in overhaul, Rickover calls you on the phone as captain once a week normally and tells you what people have found on your ship that you're doing wrong. Most of you know, if you were in an engineering plant, that you had lots of readings you took of things for pressures and temperatures and things, and you circled them with a red pen if they were out of spec, out of specification. And you weren't caring so much about how far out they were, you were caring what the trend was. If the trend was in a negative direction, you could do something about it. Well, sailors being sailors, they forget their pen. They would always, they wouldn't circle something. And I began to get harassed by naval reactors and phone calls from Rickover about the fact that my sailors weren't red circling readings. And those were not pleasant phone calls. They were, if he called in the daytime, they were really unpleasant, full of profanity. If he called at night, his wife was he was married, sitting next to him, and he was a little more gentle, but you like the ones at night, not in the daytime. Anyway, Captain, are you not smart enough to have your sailors circle the reds, the out-of-spec readings? And yes, sir, I am. I'll do it better. So what I finally did, I bought 123 red pens, and I gave every one of my engineers a red pen, and I made him carry it in his pocket. And when I would come into his space, which you had to do on a daily basis in a nuclear power plant, instead of greeting me with captain or whatever, they showed me the pen. And he called me up. Captain Newell, did you give everyone in your engineering department a red pen? Yes, sir. I'll be damned. Slam. One more. Okay, so we pass. We get to the overhaul, we pass. And there are 13 areas that you get graded in. And Saturday morning, I haven't been off the ship in 2 weeks. I'm in Bremerton, in my quarters at Bremerton, and he said, I'm calling to give you your grades. Reactor safety, chemistry. Anyway, he gave me the score. And I said, after each one, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I got 3 kids who've never heard their dad say yes, sir to anybody. And they show up in the kitchen. And they start counting out loud. 5, 6. They got to 14. And he said, what is all that noise? And I said, sir, you always tell them the truth. My kids are counting the number of times I say yes, sir. Well, stop saying yes, sir. You know what I said? Yes, sir. And he hung up. One last story about before I get to the conclusion. One last story that I want to tell you because I want you to know the kind of man he was. And I want you to know that I have the greatest respect for this man. I am a much better officer, person, than I was before I met him. When we got to the end, we had a primary to secondary leak when we went critical at the end of the refueling overhaul. Not a serious problem, but something you have to fix. And you have to find it. And so we had to shut down right away as soon as we saw we had a little bit of radioactivity coming out of the plant. And we had to find it. Once we found it and fixed it, we had to go critical in order to prove that we got it. And the problem was that in going critical again, we would, as soon as we knew we did it, it was fine. If we hadn't done it, though, we would have had some radioactivity. So naval reactors, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the way we would do this to make sure the crew was safe is we would put the crew in gas masks in the propulsion plant. And I said to myself, I'm parked here in Bremerton, Washington. I'm going to put my crew in gas masks. They're going to go home and tell their wives that they were running a plant in gas masks. So I knew him. This is what I knew about the man. I wrote him a letter. I wrote him a letter in my own handwriting. Personal attention, Admiral Rickover. I've been talking to this guy every week for 6, 8 months. And I said, you know what? This is not good. I do not want to put my crew in gas masks. There's got to be a better way to do this. Well, naval reactors went ballistic. Did you write Admiral Rickover a personal letter and tell him you weren't going to do what we told you to do? I said, yes, I did. Then he called me up. He said, Captain, I got your letter. I'll ask you one question. If I don't put your crew in gas masks, can you explain to them why it's safe? I said, yes, sir, I think I can. Now, I had been to nuclear power school, 13 weeks. I could derive the equations for what exactly was going to happen when we went critical. So I went down in the engine room with 123 guys sitting there, and I showed them that what was going to happen was not going to, in my judgment, exceed the limit. If it did, it was not going to be something that would harm them. And I asked them, if you're willing to operate this plant under those conditions without gas masks. And I said, if you don't want to, you don't have to. You can go ashore, and when it's done, you can come back. Every single one of those guys said, sure. So I called him back and I said, I can do this. And my guys will do it also. And he said, okay. And if something happens, I will come and stand on the pier and I will meet the press. And I will tell them that I, Admiral Rickover, made this decision. And that's the kind of guy he was. We did it fine, no problem, nothing. We didn't exceed any limits and never wore gas masks. But that's the way 100 some odd nuclear submarines, 9 cruisers worked with this man. We were able to deal with a person who trusted us enough because he had trained us and prepared us. He had appointed officers and enlisted petty officers in charge, and he knew it was safe. Finally, in 2007, Dick Nixon said, look, this guy's worth 4 stars. And he gave him his 4th star. And this is what he said about Rickover. I don't mean to suggest that he's a man who is without controversy. He speaks his mind. Sometimes he has rivals who disagree with him. Sometimes they are right, and he is the first to admit that sometimes he might be wrong. But the greatness of the American military service, and particularly the greatness of the Navy, is symbolized in this ceremony making him a 4-star admiral today. Because this man, who is controversy, oh, this man who comes up with unorthodox ideas, did not become submerged by the bureaucracy. Because once geniuses are submerged by bureaucracy, a nation is doomed to mediocrity. Not one of you in this room who served in the nuclear Navy is a mediocre person. You would have been kicked off the ship. For those of you who are families who know these people, you tell that to their children and their grandchildren. He's the longest serving naval officer in history, 64 years, 3 Distinguished Service Medals, 2 Legions of Merit, Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Enrico Fermi Award, 2 Congressional Gold Medals. Bainbridge served 34 years in commission. Hymen Rickover was deeply involved in 20 of those 34 years. The Enterprise is gone now. All 9 cruisers are decommissioned. By 2020, when the CVN-60, the Kennedy, goes in commission, we will have 13 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, able to go anywhere and do anything. 2 of them right now are in the South China Sea between China and us. We have 66 nuclear-powered submarines now. The father of the nuclear navy, incredible legacy. The deterrence strategic part of this country, 1/3 of them are nuclear-powered ships and submarines. We are safe today because one man, irascible old coot that he was, never compromised, never picked people, anybody who wasn't qualified like you guys are to be in that. I'm proud to celebrate with you tonight our service in one of the first nuclear-powered ships in the U.S. Navy, and to honor the kindly old gentleman who made it possible, Admiral Hymen Rickover. Thanks.
Losing it here. Anyhow, thank you very much for your words and insight. And I think I've learned a lot too by the stories you had there, as well as many of them have. What'd you say?
Nothing. I spent a lot of time with that guy. I was a machinist mate.
Anyhow, folks, that concludes our banquet tonight, and now we will just relax a little bit and finish up the dinner and the festivities, and we'll, as I normally used to say, we'll adjourn to the hospitality room for the raffle, but if you'll just sit tight and clean a few things up, we'll sit here and have our raffle next. So thank you very much once again, Admiral Newell, and everybody have a nice rest of the evening.
Yeah.
Thank you. Joe, you can buy more tickets.
Thanks, good.
Great job. Yeah, I was a watch officer.
Thanks.
Everything worked out okay. Good. Thank you so
One
much.
more